He was hiding under the bed when his wife brought her lover into the room the night before their wedding. And what she said in that room, believing she was completely alone, was the last mistake she would ever make. A quiet man, a patient man, the kind of man his future mother-in-law called adequate at his own engagement party, and smiled while she said it. For 3 years he absorbed every slight, every condescending comment, every pointed compliment designed to remind him of his place. He never argued, he never raised his voice. He simply watched and listened and kept his own counsel, the way his father taught him to. What none of them knew, not his fiancée, not her mother, not the man she smuggled into that hotel suite, was that the quiet accountant they had spent years underestimating was sitting on top of a multi-million-dollar stake in the very firm that kept her mother's entire business alive. Every vendor payment, every contract deposit, every time that woman swiped her business card and felt powerful, it cleared through infrastructure that belonged to the man she called adequate. They built their whole world on top of him, and they never once looked down. So what happens when a man who has spent years being invisible finally decides to be seen? On his own terms, in his own time, with receipts. If this story already has your attention, do us a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and drop your city in the comments. We want to know where you're watching from today. This community is everywhere, and we see every single one of you. Now let me take you all the way back to where this started, to a Friday night in Houston, a hotel corridor, and a man who only went back for his medication. He had only gone back for his medication. That was the whole of it. No grand reason, no instinct pulling him toward the truth. Just a small orange prescription bottle sitting in the side room of the bridal suite where he had left it during the rehearsal walk-through that afternoon. Blood pressure medication he took every night at 11, medication his doctor had been very clear about skipping. Calvin Osei was a precise man. He did not skip things. The event hall on the west side of Houston was nearly empty by the time he pulled into the parking structure at 10:43 that Friday night. The rehearsal dinner had ended 2 hours earlier at a restaurant on Westheimer, all toasts and laughter, and Patricia Dupree holding court at the head of the table like she was the one getting married. Calvin had smiled through every moment of it. He had shaken hands and accepted embraces and said thank you to people whose names he was still learning. Then he had driven back to his hotel, changed out of his dress shirt, and reached for the nightstand. Nothing there. He retraced the afternoon in his head the way he did everything, methodically, without panic, the side room, the rehearsal. He had set the bottle down when he helped move a chair. He was certain of it, so he put his shirt back on and drove the 11 minutes back to the venue. The service entrance was still unlocked, the way the coordinator had promised it would be through the weekend. Calvin moved through the back corridor quietly, the way men move through spaces that are not quite theirs at hours that are not quite right. He was not supposed to be there. He knew that. He intended to be in and out in 4 minutes. He heard them before he reached the door, not arguing, not fighting, laughing, easy and low, the kind of laughter that lives between people who have been comfortable with each other for a long time. 2 voices, one of them belonged to his fiancée, the other one belonged to a man. Calvin's hand stopped on the doorframe. The bridal suite door was not fully closed. Through the gap he could see Rochelle sitting on the edge of the bed, her rehearsal dress exchanged for a hotel robe, her heels on the floor. The man standing near the window had his back to the door. He was tall. He was familiar in the way that takes a moment to place. Devon Sills, Rochelle's college ex. A man Calvin had shaken hands with at a family barbecue 14 months ago and been told was just an old friend. Calvin could have pushed the door open. He could have said something. Every reasonable instinct pointed toward exactly that. Walk in, say your name, let the room rearrange itself around your presence. Instead, he heard Devon laugh and say he wanted to stay, and Rochelle tell him the door was supposed to be locked, and Devon saying it didn't matter because Calvin was gone for the night. The side room was accessible through a second door down the hall. Calvin did not go in. He stood perfectly still in the corridor for 3 seconds, listening to the rhythm of the room on the other side of that gap. And then he took 2 quiet steps backward and went through the other door. The side room was dark. He found the bottle by memory. He put it in his pocket. And then, because he was a precise man who understood that information had weight, he stood in that dark room for 47 minutes and listened to everything. Rochelle's voice was different when she thought no one who mattered could hear her. Lighter, more direct. She talked about the wedding the way a contractor talks about a job nearing completion. She told Devon that Calvin's base salary was $91,000, that he had a retirement account she already knew the balance of, that she planned to be on the joint accounts within 30 days of the ceremony. She used the word settlement like it was a destination she had already booked. She said 18 months, maybe 24 if the paperwork got complicated, and Devon laughed again and said she had always been smarter than people gave her credit for. Then Devon asked if Calvin suspected anything. Rochelle said, and Calvin heard every syllable of this, that Calvin was sweet but he was not that kind of smart. After they left, Calvin stood in the dark for another 2 minutes. Then he retrieved his medication, walked back through the service corridor, got into his car, and drove toward his hotel. He stopped at one red light on Westheimer, where a billboard for Meridian Community Bank sat illuminated against the Houston night sky. A smiling family, a tagline about trust. Calvin looked at it for the 3 seconds the light gave him. Then the light changed, and he drove on. He pulled into the hotel parking lot at 12:19 in the morning. He did not go inside right away. He sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine off, the parking lot quiet around him. His hands were not shaking. They had never shaken, not once, not even when his father died and the world had gone suddenly and completely wrong. His father had taught him that. His father had said that the men who win are never the men who react. They are the men who sit still long enough to see the whole board. Calvin sat still. He looked at nothing in particular through the windshield, and somewhere behind his eyes the quiet machinery of his mind was already moving, already measuring, already counting the things that other people had never thought to count. He said nothing out loud. He did not need to, but before he got out of the car, one sentence surfaced in his mind the way sentences do when they have been true for a long time and finally have somewhere to go. I look at numbers other people miss. He took his medication at 12:23, exactly as prescribed, and went inside to sleep. To understand what Calvin Osei was before that Friday night, you have to understand where he came from. He grew up in the 3rd Ward in a house that smelled like cedar and groundnut soup, the son of 2 people who had crossed an ocean with almost nothing and built something solid anyway. His father, Kofi Osei, worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the city of Houston. He drove a modest car. He wore modest clothes. He spoke quietly and he thought carefully, and he never once let anyone outside that house know the full picture of what he had accumulated. That was not accident. That was philosophy. Kofi used to say it the same way every time, standing at the kitchen sink after dinner, not looking at anything in particular. Never let anyone count your money but you. Calvin heard it so many times that it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like weather. Just a permanent condition of the world he lived in. Kofi Osei died 18 months before the wedding. Calvin carried that loss the way he carried everything else, inward, quiet, without display. He met Rochelle Dupree at a professional mixer in Midtown 3 years before the events of that Friday night. She was striking and quick-witted, and she laughed at something Calvin said about depreciation schedules in a way that made him feel briefly and completely like the most interesting man in the room. He fell in love with her in the honest and uncomplicated way that certain men fall, fully, without reservation, without a single protective calculation. He believed she felt the same. He was wrong about that. But he did not know it yet. Patricia Dupree entered his life 6 weeks after Rochelle did, and she entered it the way a weather system enters a room, with pressure, with volume, and with the absolute certainty that the atmosphere would rearrange itself around her. Patricia had built Dupree's signature events from a folding table and a phone book into a legitimate Houston operation with a real client list and a real office on the Southwest side. She was proud of that. She had earned the right to be proud of that. The problem was that her pride had curdled somewhere along the way into a fixed belief that she could measure any person in a room within 90 seconds and that her measurements were always correct. She measured Calvin Osei at their first dinner and came up with adequate. She never revised that number. The condescension was never loud. Patricia was too refined for loud. It came in the form of a compliment aimed just slightly past him, a question about his work that dropped before he finished answering, a rearranged seating chart that placed him at the perimeter of every gathering as though he were a guest at his own relationship. At the engagement party, she threw, at her house, on her budget, on her terms. She pulled 2 women from her church circle close and said, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as Calvin was standing, that Rochelle had always had the most generous heart. The women smiled. Calvin heard it. He picked up his glass and looked at the backyard and said nothing. That was the night of the engagement dinner. They had moved from the party to a smaller gathering around Patricia's dining room table, family and a handful of close friends, good food, gospel playing low in the background, the smell of Patricia's pot roast hanging over everything like a declaration. Somewhere between the first course and the second, Patricia turned her attention to Calvin with the particular energy of a woman who has decided to be gracious and wants credit for it. She said she understood he was in finance. She said it with the tone of someone confirming a minor detail. Calvin said he was a forensic accountant, yes. She asked what that meant exactly. What did he specialize in? The table was half listening. Rochelle was talking to her cousin across the room. Calvin set down his fork, looked at Patricia with an expression that was entirely neutral, and said simply that he looked at numbers other people missed. Patricia smiled the way people smile at answers that don't impress them. She turned back to her other guests. The conversation moved on. Nobody at that table held on to what he said. Nobody except the people watching this story, who will remember it later, who will remember it at exactly the right moment. Calvin spent the next 3 years attending every family dinner, every planning meeting, every brunch and shower and church service that Rochelle and Patricia required of him. He sat where he was placed. He spoke when spoken to. He absorbed every slight with the patience of a man who had been taught that stillness was a form of power. And he went home and he went to work and he never let anyone see what the work actually looked like from the inside. Patricia rewrote the engagement party seating chart after the dessert course. She moved Calvin's nameplate 3 seats to the left without mentioning it. Calvin found his new seat, sat down without comment, and raised his glass with everyone else when the toast came around. 3 years of it, not one moment of visible reaction, not one unguarded word. And in 3 years, not one person in that family ever thought to ask what Calvin Osei actually owned. Pacing begins to accelerate from this chapter forward. The slow burn is over. Calvin pulled into the Greenway Plaza parking structure at 7:54 on Saturday morning. He had slept 4 hours. He had eaten 2 pieces of toast standing over his kitchen sink, the way his father always did when he had something serious to think through. He had not called Rochelle. He had not called Patricia. He had not told a single person what he had heard in that hotel room what he had lain still for 47 minutes, absorbing into the bones of him like cold water through a floor. He sat in his parked car and called Marcus Webb. Marcus answered on the second ring, which was not unusual. Marcus Webb was 52 years old and had been practicing law for 27 of them, and in Calvin's experience the man treated mornings the way other people treated the middle of the day, fully awake, fully present, already 2 steps ahead. Calvin told him he needed to come in. He said it was time-sensitive. He said he needed to see the full picture of everything he held inside Audit Shield Partners, LLC. Every number, every structure, every document that confirmed what was his and what was not. Marcus asked no questions. He said he would have everything pulled by the time Calvin reached the elevator. The Audit Shield offices on the 14th floor of the Greenway Plaza Tower were quiet on a Saturday, all glass and clean lines and the faint hum of a building that never fully went to sleep. Marcus was already at the conference table when Calvin walked in, a set of bound documents open in front of him, a yellow legal pad at his right hand, a cup of coffee at his left. He looked at Calvin the way a man looks at someone he has known long enough to read without asking. He did not ask. He began talking. Calvin's position inside Audit Shield Partners, LLC, was this: 34% silent equity, established 7 years earlier when the firm's founding partner, a man named Gerald Osei Bonsu, no relation, just the small coincidences of Ghanaian names in Houston, had needed a capital infusion to take on his first hospital network contract. Calvin had provided it. $240,000 drawn from an account his father had left him, the kind of account nobody knew existed because Kofi Osei had kept his business exactly the way he taught his son to keep it. The firm's current valuation sat at $6.2 million. Calvin's stake represented approximately $2.1 million in equity. On top of that, $180,000 in annual distributions moved quietly each year into an account held in his mother's name at a credit union in Stafford, Texas. None of it appeared in any financial documentation Rochelle had ever seen. She had seen his salary, she had seen his checking account, she had seen exactly what Calvin had decided to show her, which was the surface, the ordinary face of a man who went to work and came home and didn't make noise about what he was building underneath. Marcus confirmed it plainly. Every dollar of the stake was premarital. Every distribution was legally documented. No court in Texas, under any standard, could reach it through a marital claim. Calvin nodded once. Then he asked about the Meridian Community Bank contract. Marcus flipped 2 pages forward on the legal pad and found the note he had already made, because Marcus Webb was the kind of lawyer who anticipated the next question before it was asked. Audit Shield's compliance services contract with Meridian Community Bank was on an annual renewal cycle. The current contract term expired in 31 days. The standard renewal process required only a signed authorization from Audit Shield's managing partner, a role that had transferred to Calvin 6 weeks earlier when Gerald Osei Bonsu retired to Humboldt, Texas, with his wife and his fishing rods and no intention of returning. Calvin said he wanted to see the full client roster attached to the Meridian account. Marcus pulled it up on the laptop and turned the screen. Calvin read down the list with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 11 years finding the one number on a page that everyone else had walked past. He found it in 11 seconds. Dupree Signature Events, Business Banking Client, Meridian Community Bank, Southwest Houston Branch. Neither man spoke for a moment. The conference room held the silence the way a room holds heat, completely, without asking permission. Then Calvin looked at Marcus and said he wanted to form a holding entity. He wanted his Audit Shield equity transferred into it before the end of the business day on Monday. He wanted it clean, he wanted it documented, and he wanted it done without a single public filing that would be visible to anyone running a casual search on his name. Marcus wrote on the legal pad. He said they would call it Osei Holdings, LLC. He said the transfer could be completed within 72 hours and would be entirely lawful and entirely invisible to anyone who did not have direct access to the filing. Calvin said good. Marcus said nothing moved publicly yet, and Calvin said that was correct. Nothing moved publicly yet. Marcus capped his pen and looked across the table. He asked Calvin if he was sure about all of it. Not doubtful, not cautioning, just asking, the way a precise man asks before he sets something irreversible in motion. Calvin said he had been sure since 10:45 the night before. Marcus uncapped his pen. The plan didn't need to be loud, it only needed to be precise. By Saturday afternoon, the machinery was already moving. Osei Holdings, LLC was filed with the Texas Secretary of State's office at 2:17 in the afternoon, while the city of Houston went about its weekend business entirely unaware. Marcus handled the paperwork with the practiced efficiency of a man who had structured far more complicated instruments than this and found it all routine. The equity transfer, Calvin's full 34% stake in Audit Shield Partners LLC, valued at $2.1 million, moved cleanly into the new holding entity, was documented, notarized, and complete before the sun touched the western edge of the Houston skyline. Premarital assets properly structured were beyond the reach of any future marital claim under Texas law. Calvin signed where Marcus told him to sign. He did not linger over any of it. His handwriting was the same on every page, steady, unhurried, the penmanship of a man whose father had made him practice it at a kitchen table in the Third Ward, until it looked like something worth leaving behind. On Sunday morning, Calvin called the event hall's venue coordinator. He was polite. He was brief. He said the event scheduled for that Saturday would not be taking place, that the matter was personal, and that he hoped the inconvenience to the hall would be minimal. The coordinator, to her credit, asked no questions. She said she would process the cancellation. Calvin thanked her and ended the call. He did not call Rochelle. He did not call Patricia. He had nothing to say to either of them yet. The time for words would come, but it would come on his terms, in his sequence, at the moment of his choosing. Until then, silence was the most precise instrument he had. On Sunday evening, he sat at the kitchen table in his Third Ward house, the same table where his father had taught him fractions, where his mother still spread the church bulletin every Sunday after service, where nothing important had ever been said loudly, and he wrote his mother a note by hand. He told her the wedding was off. He told her she did not need to worry. He told her that the account in her name at the Stafford Credit Union was fine and would remain fine, and that he would explain everything when he was ready, and that he loved her, and that he was okay. He folded the note, put it in an envelope, and drove it to her house on Tierwester Street. He put it in the mailbox. He did not knock. It was late, and she would have been in bed, gospel station playing low on the clock radio the way it always did, and he did not want her to see his face until he had more to show her than a cancelled wedding and a steady voice. He drove home. Monday was paperwork. Marcus finalized the Osei Holdings documentation and delivered the full package to a secured digital filing. Calvin reviewed every page. He found no errors because Marcus Webb did not make errors, but Calvin looked anyway because that was who he was. The man who checked the numbers one more time, even when he was already certain. On Monday afternoon, Marcus explained the Meridian lever in plain terms, the way he always explained things when the stakes were high enough to require clarity over elegance. Audit Shield's compliance services contract with Meridian Community Bank renewed annually. Non-renewal by the managing partner, Calvin, would trigger a standard transition period during which Meridian would engage an interim compliance team to maintain regulatory continuity. That interim team, following standard banking protocol, would conduct a full account audit across all flagged and high-activity business accounts. Any irregularities that the previous compliance contractor had been quietly absorbing into the background noise of routine monitoring would be surfaced and escalated. Calvin had not manufactured the irregularity in Patricia's account. He had not planted it, invented it, or arranged for it to exist. It had been there for 2 years, quietly papering itself over because Audit Shield's compliance infrastructure had been doing its job too well, catching the flag internally, logging it, and moving on without escalation because the numbers never crossed the formal reporting threshold under their monitoring parameters. The moment Audit Shield stepped away, that threshold became someone else's to set. Calvin was not doing anything to Patricia Dupree. He was simply stopping doing something for her. He was withdrawing the protection she had never known she had. He was stepping back and allowing the truth she had been insulated from to finally reach her. There was a cleanness to that, a mathematical precision that felt, to Calvin, like the only appropriate response to what had been done to him. Marcus drafted the non-renewal notice on Monday evening. 1 paragraph. Professional letterhead. The stated reason was strategic refocus of the firm's compliance services portfolio toward larger institutional clients. It named no individuals. It contained no grievance. It was exactly the kind of letter that arrived in corporate inboxes every quarter and produced nothing more than a polite acknowledgement and a search for a replacement vendor. It was the most dangerous letter Calvin Osei had ever had a hand in writing. Marcus sent it Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Across the city at that exact moment, at a brunch hosted by Patricia Dupree's closest friend at a restaurant in the Museum District, Patricia was sitting at a round table with 7 women who had known her for 20 years, being celebrated as the mother of an almost bride. Someone had ordered mimosas. Someone had ordered the shrimp and grits. Patricia was in her element, poised, performative, the undisputed center of her own social orbit. She raised her glass. And at Meridian Community Bank's compliance desk on the southwest side of Houston, a notification appeared in the incoming correspondence queue, was time-stamped, logged, and forwarded to the transition planning team. Patricia Dupree had no idea. She never did see it coming. The first domino fell on a Wednesday. Meridian Community Bank's interim compliance team had been in place for 9 days when they ran their initial account screening. It was standard procedure. Every transition triggered it. The team worked through the roster methodically, flagging accounts that met certain irregularity thresholds. Mismatched vendor payments, inconsistent payroll timing, deposits that didn't align cleanly with declared revenue cycles. Dupree's signature events hit 3 flags in 40 minutes. The irregularity had been there for 2 years, a recurring pattern of invoice adjustments that landed just below the standard reporting threshold, the kind of careful, deliberate manipulation that looked like administrative error if you saw it once and looked like something else entirely if you saw it 18 times in sequence. The previous compliance infrastructure had absorbed it. The interim team had no such context. They flagged it. They escalated it. And on Wednesday morning at 11:42, Meridian's compliance officer initiated a formal account freeze pending review. Patricia was on the phone with a client when the freeze notification arrived in her email. She was mid-sentence, describing the floral arrangements for a June reception, her voice smooth and professional, the voice she used when she needed someone to feel that their money was in the most capable hands, in Houston, when she glanced at her screen and saw the subject line. Account Action Notice. Dupree's signature events. Meridian Community Bank. She ended the call in under a minute. She called Meridian directly. She was transferred twice. She was told, in the flat and unhurried language of institutional compliance officers everywhere, that the account was under review, that no transactions could be processed during the review period, and that a timeline could not be provided at this time. Patricia asked to speak to a manager. The manager said the same things, in the same order, with the same absence of urgency. Patricia hung up. By that afternoon, The news had traveled the way bad news travels through vendor networks, fast and sideways. The florist she owed $1,400 called to confirm the payment that had not cleared. The linen rental company put a hold on her standing credit line. By end of business Thursday, 5 of her 6 spring contracts had either suspended or formally withdrawn. The 6th held on for 4 more days before the bride's mother, who had heard something at her own bank, quietly instructed her attorney to send Patricia a termination notice. 8 days, 6 contracts, $280,000 in projected spring revenue. Gone. Patricia called Rochelle on a Friday evening, her voice stripped of its usual performance, tight and clipped in a way Rochelle had never heard from her mother in her adult life. She told Rochelle about the freeze. She told her the spring season was collapsing. She told her it was a compliance issue, a misunderstanding, something that would be resolved. Rochelle asked about the irregularity specifically. She used the word. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. The crack between them opened right there, not wide, not yet, but present. Rochelle had spent 3 years watching her mother operate Dupree signature events with the confidence of a woman who believed her own infallibility. The silence on that phone call was the first time the infallibility had a visible seam running through it. Rochelle hung up and called Devon Sills. She needed to tell him what was happening. She needed to talk through the timeline, the finances, what it meant for the plan they had been running together for 8 months. Devon had always been steady on the phone, calm, practical. Devon did not answer. She called again, Saturday morning. He did not answer. She sent 3 messages over the following 24 hours. The first 2 got no response. The third one, she could see, was read. He simply did not reply. Devon Sills had done the arithmetic. No wedding meant no legal access to Calvin's accounts. No legal access meant no settlement. No settlement meant the entire reason he had re-entered Rochelle Dupree's life had evaporated as cleanly as morning fog on the Gulf. He was engaged to another woman 4 months later, but that comes later in this story. For now, Rochelle was alone in an apartment her mother could no longer afford to subsidize. Patricia, in the first week of financial retrenchment, quietly cancelled the automatic transfer that covered Rochelle's rent. She did not announce it. A notification from the bank did. Rochelle packed 2 bags and drove to her cousin's place in Pearland. Patricia, meanwhile, had spent the better part of 2 weeks trying to locate the source of her catastrophe. She had called Meridian 4 times. She had hired a small accounting firm on a rushed engagement to review her books. She had asked everyone she knew, her attorney, her banker, her business neighbor 2 doors down, if they had heard anything about Audit Shield Partners changing its service arrangements with Meridian. Nobody knew anything. Calvin's name did not appear anywhere. There was no trail that led to him, no fingerprints on the door, no record of a phone call, an instruction, a grievance filed. From the outside, what had happened to Patricia Dupree looked exactly like what it technically was. An internal compliance review that surfaced a problem she had created herself, in her own books, with her own hands, over 2 years of quiet and deliberate manipulation. Patricia sat alone in her office on a Thursday evening, 5 weeks after the cancelled wedding. The spring contract files were spread across her desk like evidence. 6 folders, 0 active clients, her Meridian account still frozen, her vendor relationships fractured, her daughter in Pearland, her reputation, which she had spent 30 years building in this city, beginning to develop the kind of cracks that people notice at church and don't mention to your face. She had no idea who had done this. She had no idea where to point her fury. She was about to find out. He came on a Thursday afternoon, 5 weeks after the wedding that never happened. No phone call ahead, no announcement. Calvin Osei walked into the offices of Dupree Signature Events at 2:15 in the afternoon, wearing a charcoal suit, a white shirt with no tie, and the same expression he had worn at every family dinner for 3 years. Calm, unreadable, entirely present. The receptionist Patricia had hired part-time recognized him. Her eyes went wide. She reached for the phone. Calvin told her gently that it was all right. He said he would just be a moment. Patricia was at her desk when he stepped through the inner office door. She looked up, and something moved across her face. Surprise first, then something harder, something that had been building for 5 weeks with nowhere to go. She stood up slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried every ounce of the fury she had been storing since the day her spring season collapsed. She told him he had some nerve. She told him about the deposit she had placed on the venue, $14,000 non-refundable. She told him about the catering contract, the florist, the invitations already printed and mailed to 200 people. She told him what the cancellation had cost her, what it had cost Rochelle, what it had done to her family's standing in circles that Patricia had spent 30 years cultivating. She told him he was cruel. She told him he was small. She used the word adequate right there in her own office, deliberate as a slap. Calvin let her finish. He did not interrupt. He did not shift his weight. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, and he let her empty every word she had been carrying. And he waited until the room went quiet, and Patricia had nothing left to throw. Then he sat down in the chair across from her desk, uninvited, and he began to talk. He told her about Friday night. He told her about the medication, the orange prescription bottle, the blood pressure pills his doctor had been clear about. He told her about the service entrance, the corridor, the voices he heard approaching. He told her about sliding under the bed in the bridal suite of the event hall she had paid for, in the room she had reserved for her daughter 16 hours before the ceremony she had planned down to the last floral centerpiece. He told her he had lain there for 47 minutes. He told her everything Rochelle had said. He did not summarize it. He rendered it in full. The salary figure Rochelle had quoted to Devon Sills, the account balances she had described, the 18-month timeline, the word settlement, spoken in the easy tone of a woman describing a travel itinerary. He said it all slowly, evenly, without anger, watching Patricia's face rearrange itself in real time, as the picture she had built of her daughter and of Calvin and of the entire situation she believed she understood came apart, piece by careful piece. Patricia opened her mouth once. Calvin raised one hand, just slightly, and she closed it. He was not finished. He told her about Audit Shield Partners, LLC. He told her what the firm did: financial compliance infrastructure, contract services, regulatory monitoring for institutional banking clients. He told her that Audit Shield had held the primary compliance contract with Meridian Community Bank for 7 consecutive years. He let that land. Then he told her to think about where Dupree Signature Events banked. He watched her face. He saw the exact moment she understood. He told her that every vendor payment she had processed, every payroll transfer, every business card transaction that had cleared through Meridian Community Bank for the past 7 years had moved through a compliance infrastructure that his firm built, maintained, and monitored. He told her that for 7 years, the system that kept her business account protected, flagged, and operationally sound was a system that answered ultimately to him. He told her that 6 weeks ago, as managing partner, he had declined to renew Audit Shield's contract with Meridian, citing strategic refocus. He told her that the non-renewal had created a transition gap. He told her that during transition gaps, interim compliance teams conducted full account audits using their own screening parameters, and that those parameters were not calibrated to absorb the kind of recurring invoice irregularities that Patricia's books had been carrying for 2 years. He had not reported her. He had not manufactured anything. He had simply stepped back. And then Calvin O.C. leaned forward slightly in the chair, and in a voice that was quiet and final and completely without cruelty, he said it. He said that she had asked him, at his own engagement dinner what he specialized in. He reminded her that he had answered her. He said he specialized in numbers other people missed. He said it turned out she was one of them. Patricia stared at him. The color had drained from her face in stages, like water leaving a basin, and what was left was something raw and exposed that Patricia Dupree had probably not shown another person in 20 years. She tried to reframe it. She said Rochelle had acted alone, that she had never sanctioned any plan, that Calvin had no proof of her personal involvement in anything. Her voice had lost its performance. It was thinner now, reaching. She told him she would call her attorney. Calvin reached into his jacket pocket and placed a business card on her desk. Marcus Webb, attorney at law, Webb and Associates. He said that was an excellent idea and that Marcus would be available to receive any correspondence on his behalf. He stood up. He straightened his jacket, he walked to the door, and as his hand touched the frame, Patricia Dupree, the woman who had called him adequate at his own engagement party, who had moved his nameplate to the edge of every table, who had spent 3 years performing the quiet theatre of his insufficiency, made a sound that was not quite a word. Calvin did not turn around. He walked down the hall, through the reception area, and out into the Houston afternoon, where the sky was wide and blue and entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside that office. He got in his car, he drove home, and Patricia Dupree sat alone in a room that had always felt like power, surrounded by the proof of everything she had done to herself, with no one left to blame and no story left to tell. 6 months later, the world looked nothing like it had. Patricia Dupree settled with Meridian Community Bank on a Tuesday morning in late autumn in a conference room with no windows and a lawyer she could barely afford. The settlement amount was $47,000, drawn from personal savings because the business accounts were still impaired, and the business credit line had been formally downgraded to a classification that made future lending a distant and difficult prospect. The terms of the settlement required a signed acknowledgement of the accounting irregularities and a structured repayment arrangement that would follow Patricia for the next 4 years like a shadow she could not outrun. Dupree's signature events did not close, but it shrank to a single-person operation. Patricia, answering her own phone, booking her own appointments, driving her own van to vendor meetings she used to send assistants to. The spring contract season never recovered. The word had traveled the way bad news travels in tight professional circles, quietly, efficiently, and with tremendous staying power. At the church Patricia had attended for 22 years, people were kind to her face. They always were. But the invitations to lead the hospitality committee thinned out. The callbacks from the planners she used to lunch with came slower. A woman who had built her entire identity around being the most capable person in any room she entered was now, quietly and undeniably, a cautionary tale. She had no one to blame but herself. That was the part that must have been hardest to live with. Rochelle Dupree moved into her cousin Vanessa's spare room in Pearland in the second week of what should have been her honeymoon. She took 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen things and left the apartment she could no longer afford without telling anyone she was going. Devon Sills was announced as engaged to a woman named Courtney, a dental hygienist from Katy, Texas, 4 months after he stopped returning Rochelle's calls. Rochelle found out the way people find out about these things now: a photograph, a Sunday afternoon, the particular cruelty of a timeline that does not care about your feelings. She had traded a man who loved her for a future that evaporated. She would have a long time to sit with that. Calvin, meanwhile, was building something. The Cornelius Osei Financial Literacy Fund was incorporated as a non-profit entity under Osei Holdings LLC in the 3rd month after the confrontation. Calvin committed $200,000 to its founding endowment, money drawn from the distributions that had been accumulating in his mother's account at the Stafford Credit Union, funds that had originated from the firm Rochelle and Patricia, had spent 3 years convinced he barely understood. He named the fund after his father. He did not announce it. He did not hold a press event. He simply filed the paperwork, signed the founding documents at his kitchen table, and began the process of finding 24 young men and women from the Third Ward who wanted to learn how money actually worked. The first cohort met every Tuesday and Thursday evening in a community centre on Blodgett Street, 2 blocks from the house where Calvin grew up. They were between the ages of 19 and 27. Some of them were working 2 jobs. Some of them had never had a checking account. Some of them sat in those folding chairs with the focused, hungry attention of people who had always suspected that the financial world operated by rules nobody had bothered to teach them, and who were right. Calvin taught them forensic accounting basics. He taught them how to read a contract. He taught them the difference between an asset that builds equity and a liability that performs like one. He taught them his father's maxim, "Never let anyone count your money but you," and explained, in plain language, exactly what it meant in practice. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. Audit Shield Partners, LLC, signed 2 new hospital network contracts in the same quarter, expanding the firm's institutional portfolio significantly. Calvin's equity stake inside Osei Holdings, valued at $2.1 million the morning he sat across from Marcus Webb in the Greenway Plaza conference room, had grown to $2.6 million by the time the leaves changed. It would keep growing. That was what it did when nobody was interfering with it. At the fund's first public event, an evening reception at the community centre, modest food, a short program, the kind of gathering that felt real rather than performed, Calvin stood near the back of the room watching his first cohort talk to the donors and community members who had come to show support. A woman approached him from the direction of the refreshment table. She introduced herself as Diane Okonkwo. She said she was a structural engineer. She said she had donated to the fund because she wished something like it had existed when she was 22 and making her first financial decisions with no map and no one to call. She asked about his father. Calvin told her a little. Diane listened the way some people listen, completely, without waiting for her turn to speak. He smiled. Not a careful smile. Not the smile of a man managing a room, just a smile, uncalculated, unguarded, the kind that happens when something lands cleanly and without agenda. They talked for 20 minutes, nothing dramatic, no declarations, just 2 people in a room, speaking honestly, with no one performing anything for anyone. The following Saturday morning, Calvin drove to Forest Park Cemetery on the south side of Houston. He parked. He walked to his father's grave, which he had kept clean and visited every month since Kofi Osei was buried there 18 months ago. He stood for a while without speaking. The morning was cool, and the cemetery was quiet, and the city hummed at a distance like it always did, indifferent and continuous, and full of people keeping their own counsel. Calvin reached into his jacket pocket and took out his grandfather's cufflinks, the ones he had gone back to the hotel to retrieve, the ones that had sent him down that corridor and into 47 minutes of cold and clarifying truth. He placed them on the headstone. He stood there a moment longer. Then he got in his car and drove home. Some men are quiet because they have nothing to say. Calvin Osei was quiet because he already knew the ending. And now you do too. So let me ask you something before you go. See, what would you have done in Calvin's position? Would you have walked into that office the way he did? Would you have said less or more? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because this community always has something worth reading down there. If this story held you from beginning to end, do us one last favor and hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this one, and we read every single comment you leave. There is another story coming, and it is going to hit just as hard as this one did. Stay subscribed. We will see you in the next one.